Hi there, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to episode 271 of The Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Ideson, and I'm joined today by my good friend, Chris Sawchuck. So Chris is the Principal and Global Procurement Advisory Practice Leader at the Hackett Group. So this is Chris's second time on the show, and we're always bumping into each other at various different conferences. So it was really a pleasure to be able to welcome him back onto The Art of Procurement. And in today's episode, we actually discussed the findings of a recent Hackett Group research report titled World-Class Procurement, Redefining Performance in a Digital Era. And while our conversation does talk about emerging technologies in the procurement space, the conversation really goes much deeper as we discuss the actions that procurement leaders can take to elevate the impact of their organization in this tech-enabled era. Well, if you've been listening to any Art of Procurement episode over the past few weeks, you'll know that Tradov has very generously sponsored the show. So Tradov is a B2B platform that connects buyers and sellers across the world. And one of the things that you can do with Tradov is actually build your own private network or community. You can do that for free. So an example is one that brings together just your procurement team, where you can share information, post thought leadership that you've come across, and start discussions just amongst your team. We're actually creating a private group just for Art of Procurement listeners within Tradov. So we'll post the podcasts and articles that we come across that we think really help you on your journey to elevate the impact of procurement. So all you need to do to join is to go to artofprocurement.com/Tradov and click the Join for Free button. On logging in, you'll be directed to a page to request access to the Art of Procurement private community, and our team will do the rest. As a reminder, that's artofprocurement.com/Tradov, or you can just go to the show notes for any of our recent episodes. You'll find the link on the bottom of our show notes page as well. Okay, so let me go into the conversation with Chris. And I started out by asking Chris if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. But, to say it, procurement really found me. Mm-hmm. And, if I go back, and this is a long, long time ago, I'm an electrical engineer by background. And so I was working for companies such as United Technologies and IBM, designing computers and microprocessors, et cetera. And so I was very technical. At the same time, I was working on my MBA and decided really to, get in, more into the business side of things. And as a result of that, when I was with IBM, I had the opportunity to move more in marketing and sales with IBM. Yeah. And after a period of time, I decided to leave IBM. And, one of the opportunities that presented itself at the time was in a consulting firm. And, consulting was one of those things that I said, I'm going to go into this. I'm going to try it. I had that conversation with my wife. I'm going to try it for a couple of years and then go back and get a real job. Here I am, more than 2 decades later, and I'm still in consulting or in an advisory kind of position. But when I took that first consulting job, it was in strategic sourcing, something I never even heard of before. And so my first, opportunity was to go out and do some sourcing for an organization that was founded in the 1800s, in Kentucky. And it had an opportunity to do, strategic sourcing of, metals and steel and all kinds of different types of things. But that's how I got into it. Yeah, I will tell you that my father was in procurement for many, many, many years. And he had worked for IBM. He'd worked for Pitney Bowes. And, when I came out of college, I said, there's a couple of things I wasn't going to do. And one of those, I wasn't going to follow my dad's footsteps when it came to going into procurement. Mm-hmm. And, here
you are.
And here I am.
I know it's a broad question to ask, but I'm interested. You've been in the profession, as you said, quite a long time now. Has it really changed in those, 2 decades? Are we looking at a different profession today than we were 20 years ago? Or is it much the same, but with just, a few different words and a few different challenges?
In my perspective, it's changed quite significantly. And I'll give you a couple of perspectives. When I first started off, and I mentioned that I was in consulting, and, when you're in consulting, and this is, over 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was out there, we were out, looking at new work with new companies and convincing organizations that saving money was a good thing.
Right.
Now, not that they didn't understand that, saving costs, but helping CFOs understand that. Today, and you look at it and you fast forward to where we are today, you're not convincing organizations to do that anymore. I mean, that's a simple example, but if you look at how things were being done back then, if you look at where procurement was reporting into an organization, you look at, the focus on the procurement organization and its, recognition within a enterprise, it's completely different than where you see it today. Not that all organizations are the same,
right,
but you do see, broadly that procurement is a much broader enabling organization in a company today than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, you're not convincing people of the purpose of procurement. Maybe you're convincing people, and we're still convincing people of the how, and we're still trying to figure out the how in some regards, but not of the ultimate goal of why procurement exists.
Yeah, and a lot of it is, if you look at it today, probably one of the most common questions and discussions I have with, leaders of procurement and procurement organizations is, what else can we go do? Mm-hmm. How do we, take ourselves from how we've been valued for so many, many, many years and really start to be looked at differently, not only as that organization has saved money for the company, that's not going away.
Right.
But what are those other elements of our value proposition? And what I'm finding is it's not that procurement doesn't understand what its potential value proposition or what that is. It's convincing the rest of the organization of what that is,
right,
and their ability to actually enable that within those companies.
Now, do you find that that's on procurement to paint the art of the possible, to the rest of the organization? I know as I grew up through some organizations, there was always this feeling, well, nobody really understands what I do, nobody values what I do, and it's the stakeholders' fault, and obviously as I've matured, I see that it's really, or at least I believe that it's on us to demonstrate the value that we can provide for the rest of the organization to actually understand that. I mean, is that what you see from those that are world-class who are able to kind of transition and grow their value proposition?
Yeah, it's certainly, you have to demonstrate it, and which means you have to deliver on that value and the kinds of things that you do. But it's like anything. You earn your right by doing some of the basics to be able to go do some of the things that you would say are more sophisticated, new forms of value, et cetera, in the organization. People, it's like, you hire somebody to do work for you. You may give them a small piece of work to get started to see how they do.
Yeah. And
as they do a good job there, that responsibility or the responsibility you give to them, grows. And I think that applies to procurement as well. Mm-hmm. It has to grow, and build that base of credibility and, trust within the organization, which then, gives them the opportunity to do more.
Yeah, we have one of the things that frustrates me is this idea that we somehow deserve this seat at the table, whatever the table is, or that we have a right to be anywhere.
Yeah.
I just feel we don't have a right to anything. It's contingent upon us to demonstrate the value that we can create and provide, much like any sales organization who is selling to procurement or is selling to anybody else. Like, we have to show the value and do it in a compelling enough way that makes our stakeholders want to invite us to do more.
Exactly.
Now,
to me, it's part of life. Mm-hmm. It's like having. I use this analogy a lot when people talk about suppliers, and they'll use the idea they want to segment their supply base. They say which ones are our strategic suppliers, which ones are our preferred suppliers, which ones are our transactional suppliers, whatever way they want to go segment them. And one of the analogies I give, I said, it's sort of like relationships. You don't meet somebody the first time and, all of a sudden you're best friends. Mm-hmm. You earn that over time.
Yeah.
And it's no different with procurement or any other, whether it's procurement or finance or any other function or any people. that actually engages with another group or another person, et cetera, you have to earn that right over time. And it's built based on, doing good work, earning that trust. The challenge I think that procurement has sometimes, or anybody in that position, is it doesn't guarantee that you will be successful.
Right.
One of the things that people talk about, and we talked about it, a number of years ago, sort of identifying this idea of a trusted business advisor. And, one of the questions that we got when people asked us about that is, how do I get there? Can you come in and train us on being a trusted advisor? And I scratched my head and I struggled with that. I said, I can tell you, what it is, and what the characteristics of one are, but I'm not sure how I can train you. And so one of the things that we did is we asked leaders of procurement, what do you find that, you believe are the key characteristics of becoming that trusted business advisor? In our eyes, being a trusted business advisor is that you're sought out, right? The business is not going to make a decision without you. And if they're not seeking you out for counsel in some of their key decisions, then I would say you're probably not that trusted business advisor yet.
No.
But the thing was interesting. They highlighted 3 different characteristics. One is you got to deliver on the basics. You're never going to be trusted if you can't deliver. Save money. Get the right stuff to the right place at the right time and save some money. Okay, so if you can't do that, it's going to be difficult to ever become that trusted business advisor. The second thing is you got to have the right talent. You can have somebody that can deliver on all of that, but do you have the right talent that can develop those types of relationships and that type of trust within the organization? And then thirdly, it's the whole focus on agility. What the business is looking for is not necessarily that you come to me with some kind of cookie cutter approach, but do you have the agility to be able to shift with the changing needs that we have as a business? There may be times where savings is the most important thing to us. And that may be the case as we starting to hear more and more, noise about a potential recession.
Right.
And it's probably not potential. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. And so how do we prepare ourselves? And we in procurement might have to be in a situation where we have to back up. We were doing all these great things, and all of a sudden they now want us to focus on costs. We have to be agile as well and be able to enable them in any kind of environment. And also, I like to say, build capabilities as the organization needs them.
Yeah. So, and I think that's something we sometimes struggle with, that agility, probably as much as any of the other things that you mentioned, because, we build our processes and procedures around consistency. Like this is a consistent way we're going to do a certain thing. Does that agility come from, let me ask it in a different way. Those organizations who are successful in being agile, or at least being flexible for their organizations, how are they approaching the need to still have those policies, processes, procedures in place, but without necessarily looking at those as being the be all and end all, allowing flexibility around those?
Yeah, and I think it's a interesting question, because I think if you get too granular and it gets too prescriptive, you lose all sense of agility within the organization. One of the things that we have seen is that policies that procurement organizations have put together, if I look at policies today, that when I look at a procurement organization and we review and, advise on lots of different policies across many different types of organizations, the policies today are, I would say, much more guidance than they are as prescriptive and procedures as they were, many, many, many years ago. I remember looking at policy documents that were over 100 pages in length.
Right.
And I said, no wonder you don't have no compliance to this, because who would ever even look at this? Right.
Yeah.
And so, you have people are taking out some of that, prescriptiveness. There was a client of mine that, recently came to us, and they had put together procedures, not necessarily policies, but just procedures in terms of how they execute supplier relationship management, strategic sourcing, category management. And the first time I looked at it, I went through it. It was just pages and pages and pages, step one, step, 1.1, step 1.1.2.
Yeah, the 200-page playbook.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And nobody followed it.
Yeah.
And so I think if you want to be more agile, you're going to have to sort of think in frameworks and guidelines versus, procedures and being so prescriptive.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that so I'm going to link to a piece of research that you have published called World-Class Procurement, Redefining Performance in a Digital Age. And I know that, at the Hackett Group, you have so many benchmarks and data points. It's actually, I recommend any listeners who need benchmarks and data points in procurement, just go to the Hackett Group because, that's really, I think he's so strong in that area. So you see a lot of things that are going on across a lot of different types of organizations. And, some of the things that we talk about in the report are, some of the metrics are what I'd say are more traditional procurement metrics and where world-class organizations are versus their peer group. I'll come back to that in a minute because really what I wanted to touch on is, as we think about agility and flexibility and aligning with the needs of the business, we're constrained a lot of times by our metrics in doing that. So I wonder, what are ways that we can measure procurement performance, like demonstrate a procurement ROI that go beyond the cost saving, that may enable us to be aligned a lot more with what our business needs from us?
Yeah, I think there's different ways. And what's interesting, several years ago, or actually earlier this year, we started developing, some insight because of the comment I made earlier, was that, organizations are focusing more and more on, what can we do beyond some of the traditional value that we're creating as an organization. And so one of the things that, we have seen people do is to, really start to think about what are those other ways to create value. But then not only how to create it, but, it's like anything, people want to, bring visibility and recognition to that value that's being created. I understand it's valuable, but what happened? You actually like to get to a point that it's just intrinsic, that your value is intrinsic, that you don't have to, bring visibility to
you
that.
You don't need to justify yourself.
Exactly. But, if I go back to, again, what I said earlier on, when I was out there, when I first got into the space of procurement and, I found my way into this space and then decided not to leave. Back then, and again today, we were still trying to convince organizations that saving money was a good thing and that we ought to build a capability to enable us to do that much more effectively. I think there was the time where people didn't necessarily see that as an important, not that it wasn't important to save money, but didn't necessarily see the connection between building a true capability that can do that and what it potentially could do. Over time, obviously there were successes that organizations had in terms of being able to do that. Certainly benchmarks, as you mentioned, certainly highlighted the difference between organizations that were world-class and not world-class. Yeah. And you started bringing, really shining a light that, there are organizations that are doing this and they are saving a lot more money. They have invested more. They put much more formal capabilities in place. They've invested in, various people, technology, et cetera. I think I want that as well. And so what you saw is that organizations really started to focus on procurement around that I'll say that singular focus around its ability to deliver the saving value to the organization. And that, continues on to today. And so the question is, as procurement organizations continue to evolve, and things that we've said, many, many years ago was that, the risk in only having a singular focus on a particular type of value, expense savings, has a degree of risk to that. Mm-hmm. The old adage that we can't save ourselves to success. So what else are we going to go do? Yeah. We have capabilities. And, if the organization, sort of has been going on, what else can you do? What else can you enable us to go do? And I like to say is that if you don't want yourself to go by the wayside and be, sort of seen as a non-value adding organization and still seem strategic to the organization, you have to find other ways to create value and enable the organization.
Yeah.
In some ways, to justify the investments we've made in procurement. I mean, if we look at the salaries, we look at the investments in procurement over the last 10 years and how they've, certainly the salaries have escalated. We have to justify that. If we're not creating, I like to say, differentiation between our organization and others out there, then are you truly, how valuable really are you to the company? I mean, you're valued, but true value comes from creating competitive differentiation. And the challenge, I think, for most procurement organizations is how do they show, and do they even know that they create competitive differentiation? Mm-hmm. They typically know that they've, saved X amount in a particular year. But when asked that second question, did you create competitive differentiation? It's difficult for them to answer that.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think we have to look at other ways of creating value.
Yeah, and you're fighting with investment dollars internally. With perhaps other functions or lines of business or, product groups or whatever it may be who can probably demonstrate or have more confidence in demonstrating that value that they create. And that's what we're up against, as we fight for investment to take our profession further.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be competing.
Right.
And, I have several organizations as we speak that have, put business cases together for, some, what I would say most organizations would consider to be basic technology enablement, e-procurement, automating that P2P process, and have not been able to get the investment dollars to do that. Mainly because the return on that, or at least the way they presented the return, is not as attractive as other parts and other investments they can make. And so, it's really looking at that and how can we go do that?
There's an interesting number in the report around the stakeholder perception of procurement. How, I'd say an average organization is generally still seen as being a gatekeeper or an administrator. I think it was, just looking at it now, like 74% of stakeholders believing that procurement is a gatekeeper and administrator, whereas as top performers, it's more like it's flipped the other way. It's 77% who are a valued business partner and a procurement expert. Without that perception that you're a valued business partner or procurement expert, I think it's very difficult for you to make a claim for the investment. As you see people make that journey from being a gatekeeper and administrator to a valued business partner, I mean, are there some pretty typical steps that they take along the way, or is it very situational?
I think it's both. It's certainly situational because, you always have to look at an organization in terms of where they are today. And, it's sort of, the idea of putting a vision out there. And if part of your vision is to become, more of a trusted, valued business advisor, partner, et cetera, the question is, how do I get from where I am today to where I would like to be?
Yeah.
And, it's always interesting. I get asked a lot to spend time with organizations in helping them with strategic sourcing and category management. And in the role that I have in our company, that role is typically an advisor role. So I'm not necessarily doing consulting projects, but I'm advising them. And, as part of that, I also get myself involved in some training. And what's always interesting to me, and I always ask, organizations when I get done doing, let's just say I do a day session on strategic sourcing or a couple of days, and I get to the end of it, and I always ask them the question, we got the last 15 minutes, after spending 2 days together, and I asked him, I said, if what's going to be done differently, just so I understand that I didn't waste 2 days of my time, with you, and you didn't waste 2 days of your time in here with me, and we all leave and we go back to our day jobs and nothing changes, we've just wasted a bunch of time. What can we do to ensure that what we've talked about in here actually becomes embedded in the organization? And so we ask, and typically I like to say is, we'll put a stake out in the ground and say, listen, if you're not putting strategies together today, let's set a date, and that by that date, you all have strategies that we're going to come together and we're going to review them. The biggest challenge and pushback that I get on this is everybody has got a full plate, meaning that they're 100% utilized. And that utilization, may be more, I'll say, tactical in nature. And, the enabler here for them to be able to become more strategic, because if I asked them, I said, do you want to be more strategic? Absolutely.
Right.
Do you want to engage in doing this type of activity? Absolutely. This is what we want to be doing. So how do we free up that time? And I think as you do these types of things, you have to give thought to how do we free up some time of those individuals. Now, I have individuals, and if they're 100% utilized, and we're probably not adding any headcount, how do I free up time that they can be strategic? Because if I don't free up that time, all the training doesn't mean anything. They got to have time to do it, and so we got to create some of that opportunity. And so that's where you get into, sort of the transformation and say, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah.
This is where you start looking at technology. There's other types of ways to start freeing up some of that time with these folks. Now, the challenge is once you free up that time, they may all be raising their hands saying, yeah, I'm ready to go do that. Once you free up that time, you say, well, now that you have that time freed up, are you trained to do that? Yep, I'm trained. Now, will they execute? And will they execute in a way that you're comfortable with? And so you always have to look at individuals and find out whether or not they truly have the capability to be able to execute in a much more strategic way, or you believe they do, than where they are today.
Right. And
my perspective is you give everybody a chance.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask is, technology is always a question on people's lips, especially when, there's digitization everywhere. And in fact, part of this report is about redefining performance in the digital era. Are procurement organizations, are those leading procurement organizations making investments, I think, more advanced technology? Or are we still in a position where we're investing in automating the P2P process and, bringing in e-sourcing tools for the first time? Like, where are we from an investment perspective in technology right now?
Yeah, I mean, you would say that, every year we move forward, further and further ahead. I would say over the last few years, I mean, there seems to be, or it has been an acceleration in terms of the digestion and adoption of technology. A lot of that's still in some of the technology platforms that we've had in place for many, many years, or you might say are more traditional e-procurement and sourcing. But you are seeing the advent of a lot of emerging technologies as well. But when I look at that, if you look at some of these other technologies that have been around, what you're seeing is it's not just, say, well, they're just focusing on e-procurement again, or they're just focusing on strategic sourcing. What you're seeing is some of the emerging technologies being blended into these platforms, whether it be, I think you used the term AI, machine learning and AI into some of these capabilities. Contract management, the biggest thing there is, doing contract analysis now. It's not necessarily the contract management platforms overall, but the analysis of all the activities and all the terms and conditions. And this is where you're seeing the emergence of, AI enabled platforms to allow you to do that take a very specific task and really look for insights, within that data that's all collected that you have access to. So, I think it's building on, sort of the foundation of the technology that you have today. But there's the stack that you have to go through, at the foundation of that stack is data. Yeah. And it's still, you can get all the automation on top of it, but no struggle there. But, the idea of, the focus on master data management and how do we really get control of our vendor masters, our product masters, et cetera, item masters in terms of, that master data and keeping it up to date and how do we go about doing that in a way that they're enabling the technology that sits on top of it. So that's really a foundational thing. But, once you have all that data, then what do we go do with it? And that's really, the whole focus on analytics. How do we engage with that data? And I think one of the biggest struggles there for procurement organizations is, they struggle with all phases because there's really three phases. One is you got to get access to the data. Mm-hmm. That just continues to grow. And, the idea of big data and data lakes, et cetera, really, come to fruition here as you consider how do we bring all that data together that sits within our company, sits outside of our company, sits within, social media feeds, et cetera. How do we bring all that together? And then once we have it, how do we engage with it? And that's where you're starting to see the whole emergence of analytics and the emergence of data scientists that sit within the four walls of supply management organizations, or they're being shared. I have some clients that say, we can't afford a data scientist, but we're going to share it with the finance function or share it with two other, the IT function or something. And so they, they all take, I get a third, you get a third, and the other function gets a third, so they're bringing that together. But once you have that and you're able to engage with the data, you got to be able to tell stories with that data. And this is where I see some big gaps in terms of, the procurement professionals, is that once they have all that data, how can they take that and, you tell a story about it? What does it truly mean? Why is this important to me as a business leader in the organization? You've got this massive amount of data. Tell me what the salient points are. Why and what direction should I go as a result of all the analysis that you've done? That's valuable. And I do believe that more and more of the value that we create within the supply management function will come out of that data. Once we get very good at it and we're able to use that to be able to, provide guidance to the business in ways that we haven't, done as much in the past.
Yeah, kind of influencing and persuading with the data rather than just presenting fact and letting somebody else make a decision.
Yeah.
Master data is always, I feel it's always overlooked, and maybe it's overlooked because it's hard. And sometimes I'll see technology that have been implemented, and the feeling is that, well, once the technology is implemented, it's going to solve all of our problems. And of course, it never does, because that data strategy has never really been taken care of. The vendor master has never been really taken care of. Or you're looking at it in isolation, just within the four walls of procurement, rather than broadening your perspective of how you can work with other functions on how to get better data in. So you can make the most of it. I do think we'd still struggle with that a lot.
I agree. It's a challenge, and it's as if people, will come and say, listen, I want to do all of this predictive analytics and all these other types of, things in their organization. And, I'll tell them, I said, you have a lot of work to do before you can go do that. And your first thing is you got to master your master data first before you can actually go do that. And so, there's some roll up your sleeves kind of work that needs to be done to allow you to do some of the, I'll say, the fun analytics on the back end.
Yeah. And that takes time and resource, doesn't it? It's a really manual process to do a lot of that cleanup.
Yeah, it's certainly, it's just the architecting of it. And, it's really thinking about the end in mind in terms of, what do I really want? What kind of data do I need? What do I want to, where do I want to keep it, et cetera? But just doing the entire architecture first. But then, like you said, the manual piece is then actually going through and cleaning it up. But architecting what that's going to look like is really the first step.
So one of the areas that you look at in the report is kind of the evolving of the procurement delivery model. And this, we have age-old debates of centralized, decentralized, you name it, distributed models. Is there a trend emerging? Are we starting to devolve more responsibility back into the business as technology is allowing more self-service models? Or are we just as inconsistent and perhaps unsure? Or maybe I'd flip that to say we're building it for the based on what our organizations need, as opposed to there being an emerging trend of this is really how you should be thinking about building your procurement delivery model?
It's an interesting question. I don't, at this point, we haven't really seen a trend to, back to the business, kind of, other than, to your point, you made a comment around self-service.
Yeah.
Self-service really puts it back, to the business. And, where we've seen most of that is more in, buying and, type of activities, not necessarily in, some of the, the strategic sourcing, et cetera. Self-service is certainly an area that's growing, and you saw that in a report. But, as you look at it, it's really the whole focus on how do I architect an organization to best deliver and enable the business to be successful. Organization is just one element of an overall, and you saw us refer to that in the report, of a service delivery model.
Yeah.
And yes, it has to be considered in parallel with all the other dimensions of your service delivery model. We were talking about technology. You were talking about information. All these things have to be considered in concert, but you have to start with what are we trying to deliver? And then based on that, what's the best service delivery model we should design, in doing that? And you asked a question around, should that model be, more centralized or decentralized? You can show data that, shows, in many cases that, centralized models, there are certainly benefits to doing that. But is that always the best model?
Right.
No. I would argue that all models are center-led, that there is no model that's fully 100% centralized and fully 100% decentralized.
Yeah. It
may be 90-10, it may be 80-20, it may be 50-50, it may be, something in between. But it is a variation of, what you see is just some models have more of the, procurement may be centralized and more of it in the business. And in others, it may be more at the center and less in the business. Mm-hmm. And, so you are seeing this. And the idea is what's the best way to design it that'll enable the business to be most successful? We're seeing a continuous trend in, especially some of the big global organizations, not that this is anything new, but, the movement of activity and really the decisions of where should I actually execute activity if I have a global organization around the world. Certainly the advent of global business services centers in various low-cost, areas or lower-cost areas around the world. How do I do that? And one of the more common questions I get is, what other activity can we put into these centers? Yeah. Where is it today? Are we just looking at, sort of typical rec and PO processing type of activity, accounts payable, et cetera? Are we also seeing, the emergence of more strategic activities in these centers? The answer is yes, we are. And so, we have many organizations that have, created the foundation of having these centers in many places. As they continue to go forward, they're continuing to optimize that placement of activity in their organizations as they look at it much more globally.
Yeah, one of the things that always, was interesting to me is back 10 years ago, I lived out in India. A lot of listeners will have heard me talk about my experience in India before, but it was really a KPO versus a BPO, so a knowledge process outsourcing versus business process outsourcing, because we were really focusing on extracting data and insights from RFPs and getting, commodity data and should cost modeling and things like that. We didn't really focus on the rec to PO process particularly. And so we'd have a lot of people there who were doing a lot of data analysis. What we found is that while we got the data, the folks in the home offices didn't necessarily know what to do with it. So it was less about, so I guess where we were missing is helping the folks who are doing the strategic sourcing and the category management know what to do with the data we're providing to them. But the idea of what can you put in an offshore, like as now is a global business services function, I mean, it's relatively limitless, I think. It's bounded by your ambition of what you think you can put there and the ability of your home office teams to actually work with those professionals to get what they need to be able to do their job.
Yeah. it's really finding that balance. And, again, when you create these centers, in many cases, there are cost motives, initially to create them. Same thing with going offshore. In many cases, a lot of times the initial driver was cost. What you find over time in some cases is that, it's not just lower cost, but in some cases it's better expertise. Because we're starting to see these centers in different places develop expertise that's better than what we might have at the home office. And so now you have a developed expertise. I think it goes back to, the discussion we were having on that trusted advisor. And, we were talking about, the idea of how you have to earn your way to becoming, more trusted. I don't think it differs here. I don't see anybody going out and, in procurement and saying, all right, we're going to create an offshore location for the first time, and I'm going to take everything that we have and we're going to put it there. No, they're going to dip their toe in the water and say, listen, let's go do this first. Let's see how it works out. Let's learn a little bit from that. And then we'll slice off another piece and put it there. What we have seen is that it evolves over time, and, they start challenging themselves. Well, help me understand, why can't it be done there? Versus, what can we go move there? So the discussion changes over time.
So I know we only have a few minutes left here. I just want to briefly ask you about the use of service providers. So probably 5 years ago, procurement outsourcing was at its peak, and that was lift and shift of your entire procurement organization in some cases to a third-party provider who are going to do everything. They're going to guarantee you X amount of savings. And, a lot of organizations would then kind of wash their hands of it and just wait for the money to roll in. And, there was some organizations did well with that model. Some organizations didn't do well with that model. It feels like the last few years has been a little bit of a state of flux as to how do you actually best leverage outside help to support the goals that you have without necessarily giving everything up. And I wonder, if you're seeing any particular trends in that regard in terms of how organizations are starting to work differently with outside service providers to help them from a specifically procurement perspective.
Yeah, I think the first thing, I'll go back to, the comment I made on the service delivery model. In the paper that you're referring to, one of the things we do is highlight a service delivery model. And so we highlight 6 dimensions, human capital, technology, service design, analytics and information management, organizational governance. And then the last one is service partnering. And, it is a key component of your overall service model. And, where does it make sense to use partners to deliver on what you need to deliver? And so, as a individual or that's leading a function or a capability for a company or an enterprise, you have to consider all of these, because at the end of the day, it's about how do I deliver the best efficiency, the best value, effectiveness, as well as the best experience for those stakeholders that are engaging with the capability that I've bought, that I built. And, in some cases, the service partnering makes a lot of sense to go do that. In some cases, the service partnering makes sense because it frees up, as I was talking earlier about, this transactional activity. Well, maybe that's one way we can get rid of and eliminate some of that transactional activity by using a service partner. There's different ones out there that could potentially take on some of the activity so I can free up the time to go do this ourselves. And so these are decisions that have to be made. If we look at where we are today, one of the things that we look at are these world-class and non-world-class organizations. And one of the things that we highlight in the paper is that we're not seeing big differences in terms of the level of investment when it comes to, I'll say, the more transactional types of activities within procurement. Where we are seeing differences between the non-world-class and world-class organizations is their use of service partners to support areas like supplier management, as well as strategic sourcing, where we see the level of investment there in these world-class organizations to be anywhere from 2 to 5 times higher, depending on the process, in those organizations and their utilization of service partners. And, again, it's looking at it and say, well, is that an enabler to allowing them to do what they need to go do?
Right.
And, you have to look at their performance. Remember, world-class organizations are those that perform better. They're more effective. They're more efficient than other organizations that are out there. And so their performance is better. All we're doing is sort of peeling it back and saying, what is it different about them? And so one of the things that, we saw, over the last several years, and specifically this year, is where they're actually making those investments in using service partners.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, particularly when you mentioned the sourcing, supplier management, kind of category management, those strategic elements that a lot of time we think, well, those are our most strategic tasks, so we can't, and I don't want to use the word outsource because that's the wrong terminology, because a lot of those are supplementing your internal skill set. You're not just saying, hey, go and do this for me, and outsourcing some of those processes. But, except in those largest of organizations where you can perhaps justify the ROI of having experts in every single category, for more mid-market organizations, that actually gives them access to insights that they may not have already had, which perhaps suggests one of the reasons why a greater investment in that area is one of the drivers of being world-class versus their peer group. But because otherwise you are just running a transaction, oftentimes if you don't have the insights. So it was really fascinating to kind of see that, because it's just, I've never seen it positioned like that before.
Yeah. And there's, as you mentioned, there's lots of different types of service partners out there, not just in the traditional BPO sense,
right?
But, people use the term task sourcing. How do I take a particular task and have a third party do that for me? It may be intelligence outsourcing, where they're leveraging third parties to provide intelligence that they're not going to do themselves.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways, and I would say most every organization does some form of it, but it may not be as traditional as we, sometimes consider, traditional BPO.
Yeah, you can slice and dice pretty much every single process, whether it's strategic or tactical, can't you? And go and use the resource that's most effective to do that part. And that may be in developing your sourcing strategy and you go and execute. Or it could be in getting a coach to help you through the negotiation process, but you're doing the execution. Or it could be the entire sourcing process. It's really what fits with your organization, but the opportunity is out there to do some of those things.
Yeah, and I think the difference today is that your choices that you have, we're just talking about service partners and BPO, et cetera. But, one of the things that we highlight in the paper is the whole focus on, digital technologies, RPA, for example. So as you break apart all these different activities, processes, intelligence, all the types of things that you do as an organization, you now have, opportunities to consider what's the best way to execute that. And, what we have had as an option now is the ability to look at, robotic process automation or other smart automation techniques to be able to do that. And so there's a lot of options. And so this is where architecture of the organization becomes very, very important. And I'll say more complex than it has ever been in terms of really looking at how best to deliver with all the various options in front of you.
Yeah, there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach anymore, is there? And I think that's a good thing, because you can tailor what you need exactly to the needs of the business. But like you say, that comes with more complexity. And I think a lot more self-awareness of what the business needs from you as a procurement function. So I know it's about time to wrap up here, Chris. So the very last question that I have is, if listeners would like to connect with you directly, where would the best place for them to find you?
I would say and recommend two places. One would be to connect with me via LinkedIn if they're not already connected. Certainly I monitor that on a regular basis. The other is just to my traditional email address at the Hackett Group, and it's C Sawchuck, so my first initial C, last name CSAWCHUK at thehackettgroup.com.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Chris. What I'll do is I'll include links to your LinkedIn profile and your email address on our show notes page. Also on our show notes page, I'm going to put the link to the research report that we talked about today, which is called World-Class Procurement, Redefining Performance in a Digital Era. Our show notes, you will find them just by going to artofprocurement.com/podcast. If you search for Chris, search for Hackett, you'll find those come up. And if you're listening to this show within a few weeks of it being published, it's going to be there on the front page as well of our podcast page. So Chris, one last time, I just want to thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.